A horse chained for 7 long years, starving, broken, and forgotten by the world. But when the owner sees what the horse has endured, their reaction will leave you in tears. How did this animal survive such cruelty? And what happens when a single act of kindness changes everything? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the neglected farmland as Claire Moore pulled her sleek sedan onto the gravel driveway. Chunks of loose stone pinged against the car's undercarriage, making her wince. She parked beside a rusted mailbox that tilted at an awkward angle, its faded numbers barely readable. "What a mess," she muttered, checking her watch for the 3rd time. Tall weeds pushed through cracks in the concrete path, and the once white farmhouse's paint had dulled to a sickly gray. Claire stepped out of her car, her heels immediately sinking into the soft earth. She switched to the flat shoes she kept in her trunk for situations like this. The autumn wind whipped her dark hair around her face as she surveyed the property with growing irritation. The barn in the distance caught her attention, its roof partially caved in on one side, weathered boards hanging loose like broken teeth. "This is going to take forever to fix up," she said to herself, already calculating the costs in her head. The market for rural properties was tough enough without having to deal with years of neglect. Something about the barn tugged at her attention. Maybe there was salvageable farm equipment inside that could add to the property value. Claire picked her way through the overgrown path, swatting away persistent mosquitoes. The barn door protested with a loud creak as she pushed it open. The smell hit her first, a heavy mixture of rot, waste, and something else she couldn't quite place. Dust motes danced in the rays of sunlight that streamed through holes in the roof. As her eyes adjusted to the dim interior, movement in the far corner made her freeze. There, barely visible in the shadows, stood a horse. The animal was so thin its ribs showed clearly through its dull coat. A heavy chain connected its neck to a post, giving it barely enough room to lie down. The horse's head hung low, but at the sound of her footsteps, it slowly lifted to look at her. Claire's breath caught in her throat. The horse's eyes, though dulled by suffering, held a gentle awareness that made her stomach twist. She thought of her father in his final days, alone in his apartment, while she was too busy with work to visit. "Oh God," she whispered, taking a step closer. The horse, Dusty, she remembered Harold mentioning him once, watched her with quiet desperation. A half-empty water trough stood just out of his reach, and the ground around him was bare of hay or feed. With trembling fingers, Claire pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts. She found the number for the local veterinary clinic and pressed dial, turning away from those haunting eyes. "Yes, I need an emergency visit," she said, when the receptionist answered. "There's a horse. He's in really bad shape." She rattled off the address, adding, "I'm the realtor handling the property. We need to address this situation before it becomes a liability issue." As she walked toward the barn door, a soft whinny made her pause. The sound was barely more than a whisper, but it held such loneliness that Claire had to blink back unexpected tears. She didn't look back as she stepped into the sunlight, afraid of what she might feel if she did. The next morning's dew still clung to the grass as Claire's car crunched up the gravel driveway. She'd left home 30 minutes earlier than usual, a small bucket of water and a bag of carrots from her crisper drawer sitting in the passenger seat. She couldn't explain the nagging feeling that had woken her before dawn, pushing her to check on Dusty before work. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, but her feet carried her toward the barn anyway. The door creaked less today, as if welcoming her return. Dusty's head lifted at her entrance, his ears twitching forward with interest. Claire approached slowly, holding out a carrot. "Hey there," she said softly. "Thought you might be thirsty." Dusty watched her with cautious eyes, muscles tensing as she drew closer. She set the bucket down within his reach and stepped back, giving him space. After a long moment, Dusty stretched his neck toward the water. His movements were stiff and uncertain, but he drank deeply. Claire's stomach clenched as she watched his ribs shift beneath his matted coat with each swallow. The afternoon sun was high when Dr. Thompson's truck pulled up outside the barn. The vet was a gray-haired man with kind eyes and weathered hands that moved with gentle confidence as he examined Dusty. "Well," he said finally, straightening up, "we're looking at severe malnutrition and dehydration. His hooves need immediate attention, and there are pressure sores from the chain." He gestured to Dusty's neck. "The good news is, with proper care, he can recover. The bad news is it won't be quick or cheap." Claire crossed her arms, trying to maintain professional distance. "What kind of timeline and costs are we talking about?" 3 to 6 months minimum for full rehabilitation. You're looking at regular vet visits, farrier care, special feed, medication. Dr. Thompson listed the estimated costs, each number making Claire's chest tighter. "He'll need daily care and monitoring. Are you prepared for that commitment?" Claire looked at Dusty, thinking of all the reasons to walk away. Her busy schedule, the expense, the property she needed to sell. But something in Dusty's quiet patience held her in place. "I'll take responsibility for now," she heard herself say. "At least until he's stable." Dr. Thompson nodded and began the first treatment, administering fluids and medication. Claire watched as he worked, explaining each step. When he finished, Dusty turned his head toward Claire, surprising her by gently nudging her hand with his soft muzzle. The touch was brief but deliberate, a small gesture of trust that made Claire's throat tight. She found herself whispering, "Okay, boy. We'll give you a fighting chance." Claire pulled up to the barn early the next morning, her car trunk loaded with supplies from the farm store. Fresh hay, a bag of senior horse feed, and basic grooming tools filled her arms as she made her way inside. The morning light filtered through gaps in the barn's weathered boards, casting long shadows across the floor. Dusty nickered softly at her approach, his interest in visitors growing stronger each day. Claire set down her supplies and began clearing the area around him, scooping away years of packed dirt and moldy straw. Her shovel hit something solid, and she bent down to investigate. Beneath layers of grime lay a wooden box, its edges worn smooth by time. Claire brushed off the dirt and carefully lifted the lid. Inside, protected from the elements, she found a stack of photographs, their colors faded, but still clear enough to make out the images. Her breath caught as she studied the first photo. A man with silver hair and laugh lines around his eyes stood proudly beside Dusty, who looked like a different horse entirely. His coat gleamed in the sunlight, muscles rippling beneath a healthy shine. The man, Harold she assumed, had his hand resting on Dusty's neck, both of them radiating contentment. Determined to understand more, Claire drove down the dusty road to the nearest neighbor, a small white farmhouse with cheerful flower beds. Mrs. Jacobs, a woman with snow-white hair and wire-rimmed glasses, invited her in for tea. "Oh yes, Harold Brown," Mrs. Jacobs said, her eyes growing distant with memory. "He was such a gentle soul. That horse of his, Dusty, was his pride and joy. Harold and his wife Martha used to breed horses, you know. Had quite a reputation for raising good stock." She paused, stirring her tea. But after Martha passed, something in Harold just broke. Stopped coming to church suppers, wouldn't answer his door. Then he had that awful stroke, must be 3 years ago now. His daughter had him moved to Pine Grove Nursing Home, but nobody knew what to do about Dusty. Claire thanked Mrs. Jacobs and drove back to the barn, the photographs weighing heavy in her hands. She spread them out on a clean patch of hay, studying Harold's face in each one. The progression was clear, from the beaming man in the early photos to someone increasingly withdrawn, the light in his eyes dimming with each image. Looking up at Dusty, Claire felt a sudden wave of understanding wash over her. The chain, the isolation, they weren't signs of cruelty, but of desperate, misguided protection from a man lost in his grief. She thought of her own father's final years, how she'd buried herself in work instead of visiting him at the nursing home. The similarities hit too close to home. Claire's throat tightened as she picked up the last photo, where Harold stood alone beside Dusty, his hand gripping the chain that would become the horse's prison. In his face, she recognized the same fear of loss that had kept her from her father's bedside. The vet's truck pulled up to the barn a week after his first visit, gravel crunching under the tires. Dr. Peterson stepped out, medical bag in hand, and greeted Claire with a nod. Inside the barn, he examined Dusty carefully, checking his vitals and running his hands along the horse's protruding ribs. "There's some improvement," he said, making notes on his clipboard. "His hydration is better, and the infections are responding to the antibiotics. But we're looking at months of rehabilitation here, not weeks." Claire's stomach tightened as she signed the credit card slip. The amount made her wince, almost $1,000 for medication and treatment. She tucked the receipt into her wallet, trying not to think about her dwindling savings account. Later that evening, Claire sat across from Lisa at their favorite Italian restaurant, pushing pasta around her plate. The familiar smell of garlic and herbs filled the air as she described her unexpected role as a horse caretaker. "I just don't know what I'm doing," Claire admitted, setting down her fork. "I'm a realtor, not a horse person. And the vet bills alone." Lisa took a sip of wine and raised an eyebrow. "Since when did you become an animal rescue service? You've got that big listing coming up in River Heights. That's what you should be focusing on, not some abandoned horse." I know, Claire sighed. "But you haven't seen him, Lisa. The way he looks at me." "Look at you, getting all soft," Lisa teased, then grew serious. "But honestly, Claire, you don't owe this horse anything. Sometimes you have to think about yourself first." The words followed Claire back to the barn that night. She switched on the portable lamp she'd brought, casting a warm glow over Dusty's stall. The horse had been lying down when she arrived, but at the sound of her footsteps, he stirred. Claire watched in amazement as Dusty planted his front hooves firmly on the ground, then slowly pushed himself up. His legs trembled with the effort, and for a moment she thought he might fall. But he stayed standing, swaying slightly, his eyes fixed on her. Tears welled up in Claire's eyes as she watched his display of strength. All the doubts and practical concerns faded away in that moment. She stepped closer to Dusty, her voice barely above a whisper. "I won't give up on you," she said, realizing as the words left her mouth that she meant them with every fiber of her being. Whatever the cost, whatever the sacrifice, she couldn't walk away now. The next morning, Claire sat at her kitchen table, staring at the old photos spread before her. On the back of one, she found an address scribbled in faded ink: Oakwood Care Center. Her hands shook slightly as she dialed the number. "Yes, Harold Brown is still with us," the receptionist confirmed. "Are you family?" "No, Claire hesitated. "I'm calling about his property." After a few more questions, Claire learned that Harold's daughter lived just 20 minutes away. She found Susan Brown's number in the local directory, and after several attempts to rehearse what she'd say, finally pressed dial. Susan agreed to meet at a local coffee shop that afternoon. Claire recognized her immediately. She had Harold's eyes. The resemblance made Claire's throat tighten as she approached the table. "Thank you for meeting me," Claire said, sliding into the chair across from Susan. "I wanted to talk about your father's property." Susan wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, her expression guarded. The old farm? I haven't been there in years." As they talked, Susan's polite demeanor couldn't quite mask the underlying tension in her voice. She spoke about Harold's decline after her mother's death, how he'd withdrawn from everyone, including his own children. "The horses were always his passion," Susan said, staring into her cup. "But after Mom died, it became obsessive, especially with Dusty. He wouldn't let anyone near him." She looked up, her eyes hard. "Do you know what it's like to compete with a horse for your father's attention? To watch him miss your graduations, your wedding, the birth of your children, because he couldn't leave that farm?" Claire felt the weight of the unspoken question. "Why are you really here?" She looked at the nursing home's address again, then at Susan's number in her phone. The choice weighed heavily on her. Reveal the truth about Dusty and potentially destroy any chance of reconciliation, or keep silent and let the past remain buried. Claire's heels crunched on the gravel as she approached the barn that evening. The setting sun cast long shadows through the broken slats, and something felt wrong before she even opened the door. Her heart dropped when she saw Dusty lying on his side, his breathing labored and irregular. "No, no, no," she whispered, rushing to his side. Dusty's eyes were glazed with pain, his body trembling. She fumbled with her phone, dialing the vet's number with shaking fingers. Dr. Martinez arrived within 20 minutes, his face grim as he examined Dusty. "It's colic," he said, checking the horse's vital signs. "His gut's not functioning properly. Could be from the sudden change in diet, or the stress of everything he's been through." "But you can fix it, right?" Claire's voice cracked. The vet straightened up, his expression serious. "Colic can be fatal in horses, especially ones as weak as Dusty. The next 12 hours will be critical. He'll need constant monitoring." Claire nodded, already shrugging off her blazer. "I'll stay with him." As the night deepened, Claire sat on a hay bale beside Dusty, running her fingers through his tangled mane. The barn creaked and settled around them, and memories of her father flooded back. How he'd sit alone in his garden every evening after retirement. How she'd always been too busy with work to visit more than once a month. "I get it now," she whispered to Dusty, her voice thick with emotion. "I understand how Harold could lose himself in grief. I did the same thing, didn't I? Buried myself in work instead of facing Dad's loneliness after Mom died." Dusty shifted slightly, letting out a soft grunt of pain. Claire stroked his neck, remembering the last time she'd seen her father. He'd asked her to stay for dinner, but she'd made an excuse about an early meeting the next day. "I was just like Susan," she continued, wiping her eyes. "So angry at being left behind that I couldn't see past my own hurt. And look what it cost me, cost us both." Through the long hours, Claire talked to Dusty about her father, about regret, about second chances. The horse's labored breathing gradually became her meditation, each inhale a reminder of life's fragility, each exhale a prayer for morning. As the first rays of dawn filtered through the barn's broken roof, Dusty lifted his head slightly. His breathing had steadied, and some of the pain had left his eyes. Dr. Martinez, who had checked in twice during the night, examined him again. "His vital signs are improving," the vet said, relief evident in his voice. "He's not out of the woods yet, but this is a good sign." Claire sagged against the stall wall, exhaustion hitting her all at once. Her designer clothes were covered in dirt and hay. Her makeup long since cried away. But as Dusty nudged her hand weakly with his nose, she felt something shift inside her, a certainty that hadn't been there before. "We're going to get through this," she promised him softly. "Whatever it takes." Claire stared at her phone for a long moment before making the call. Her fingers hovered over the number for Hope's Haven Animal Rescue that she'd found online. The events of the past night had shown her she couldn't do this alone. Taking a deep breath, She pressed dial. Within hours, a small group arrived at the barn. Tom, a weather-worn man in his 60s wearing a well-loved cowboy hat, immediately assessed the situation with experienced eyes. Beside him stood Megan, a cheerful vet tech with her brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "Poor fellow's been through quite an ordeal," Tom said, his voice gentle as he approached Dusty's stall. The horse's ears pricked forward, showing interest despite his weakness. "We brought supplies," Megan announced, already unloading bags of fresh bedding and specialized feed from their truck. "First things first, let's make this space more comfortable for him." The volunteers worked efficiently, clearing out the old hay and debris. Claire found herself swept up in their energy, following their lead as they transformed the dingy stall. Tom showed her how to properly lay fresh bedding while sharing stories from his ranching days. "Horses are like people," he explained, spreading clean straw. "They need trust and patience. I had this mare once, scared of her own shadow. Took months of gentle handling, but she turned out to be the most loyal horse I ever had." Megan demonstrated how to approach Dusty, her movements slow and deliberate. "Let him come to you," she advised Claire. "Hold your hand out, palm up. Let him know you're not a threat." Claire mimicked Megan's actions, her heart lifting when Dusty stretched his neck toward her hand. The horse's breath tickled her palm, and she felt tears spring to her eyes. "That's it," Megan encouraged. "He's starting to trust you." As the afternoon progressed, the barn began to feel less like a place of neglect and more like a space of healing. The volunteers installed proper water buckets, hung hay nets, and even fixed some of the broken boards in the stall. Tom worked on the stall door, making it easier to open and close. "A horse needs to feel secure," he explained, "but also needs to know he's not trapped." After several hours of work, Dusty seemed more alert than Claire had ever seen him. With gentle coaxing from Tom, the horse took several shaky steps around his newly cleaned stall. "Look at that!" Megan exclaimed, clapping her hands softly. "He's got spirit," Tom nodded approvingly. "Just needed some folks to believe in him." Claire watched as Dusty explored his improved surroundings, his movements still weak but purposeful. The volunteers' enthusiasm was contagious, and she felt something she hadn't experienced since finding him. Real hope. "Thank you," she said, looking at the small group that had given up their Saturday to help a stranger and a neglected horse. "I didn't know how I was going to do this by myself." "You're not by yourself anymore," Megan replied, squeezing Claire's arm. "That's what community is for." Claire's footsteps echoed through the quiet hallway of Oakwood Nursing Home. Her hands clutched the manila envelope containing the old photos, her heart beating faster with each step. Room 214 appeared on her right, and she paused, taking a deep breath before knocking. "Come in," a weak voice called out. She entered to find Harold Brown sitting in a wheelchair by the window. He was thinner than in the photos, his shoulders hunched and his hands trembling slightly in his lap. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting shadows across his weathered face. "Mr. Brown?" Claire stepped forward. "I'm Claire Moore. I've been taking care of your property." Harold's pale blue eyes studied her face, but he remained silent. Claire pulled up a chair and sat beside him, carefully removing the photos from the envelope. "I found these in the barn," she said softly, holding out the first photograph. It showed a younger Harold standing proudly next to Dusty, both of them looking healthy and happy. Harold's hand shook as he took the photo. His eyes welled with tears. "Dusty," he whispered. "You found him?" Claire nodded gently. "Yes, I did." The old man's shoulders began to shake. "Martha loved that horse so much," he said, his voice breaking. "She'd spend hours with him, brushing his coat until it shone like copper in the sun." He traced the outline of the horse in the photo with a trembling finger. "After she passed, I couldn't bear to lose anything else that reminded me of her. We'd already lost Shadow to those poachers in the forest. Harold's voice grew bitter. They hunted horses for meat, shot poor Shadow right there among the trees. He looked up at Claire, his eyes filled with shame. I was so afraid they'd get Dusty too. I thought keeping him chained would keep him safe. But then the stroke hit, and I couldn't. His voice trailed off as tears rolled down his cheeks. Claire reached into her bag and pulled out the stack of letters. I also found these, she said quietly. Harold's eyes widened as he recognized his own handwriting on the envelopes. The letters, he breathed. I wrote them every week for months, but I could never find the courage to send them. How do you apologize for pushing away the people you love most? His hands trembled as he touched the unopened envelopes. I've made so many mistakes, he whispered. Claire leaned forward, placing her hand gently on his arm. Mr. Brown, I want you to know that Dusty is alive. He's recovering. We have a whole team of people helping him get better. Harold's face crumpled, and he began to sob quietly. Thank you, he managed between tears. Thank you for giving him a chance. For giving me a chance to make things right. Claire drummed her fingers nervously on her steering wheel before picking up her phone. She had saved Susan's number from their last meeting, but actually pressing the call button felt like lifting a heavy weight. Taking a deep breath, she dialed. Hello? Susan's voice was guarded. Hi, Susan. It's Claire Moore. We met about the property last week. Claire tried to keep her voice steady. I visited your father yesterday. There was a long pause on the other end. I see. He's not doing well, Susan. And I think you should know. Dusty's alive. We're helping him recover. That horse... Susan's voice turned cold. Dad chose that horse over his own family. Now he feels guilty? It's too late for that. I understand your anger, Claire said softly. But Dusty's recovery could be a chance for healing. Not just for him, but for your family too. Your father wrote you letters. Dozens of them. He just never sent them. Letters? Susan's voice wavered slightly. Would you consider visiting him? Just once. I'll go with you if you'd like. After what felt like an eternity, Susan sighed. Fine. One visit. 2 days later, Claire stood in Harold's room as Susan walked in. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Harold's eyes filled with tears at the sight of his daughter, but Susan's face remained stony. Why now, Dad? Susan's voice cracked. After all these years. Harold's hands trembled in his lap. I lost myself when your mother died, he whispered. I couldn't face losing anything else she loved. We were right here. Susan's voice rose. Your grandchildren grew up without knowing you because you couldn't see past your own grief. Claire stepped forward gently. Susan, maybe we could look at those letters together. She pulled them from her bag, offering them like a peace offering. Harold's voice shook as he spoke. Every letter, every one of them is an apology I was too afraid to send. Your mother loved Dusty so much. When she died, he was all I had left of her. I thought if I could just keep him safe. His voice broke, and tears began rolling down his cheeks. But I lost everything else that mattered. I lost you. Susan's rigid posture softened slightly as she watched her father cry. She took one of the letters with trembling hands, opening it carefully. I can't promise I can forgive everything, Susan said quietly, looking at her father. But I could come visit again next week. Harold nodded, wiping his eyes. That's more than I deserve, he whispered. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered barn as Claire, Tom, and Megan worked together to set up the makeshift paddock. Tom hammered the last post into place, while Megan secured the rope fencing, creating a safe space for Dusty's first venture outside. "Everything's ready," Tom said, wiping his brow. "Now comes the tricky part." Claire nodded, her stomach tight with nervous energy. She walked into the barn where Dusty stood in his stall, his coat already looking healthier after weeks of care. "Ready for some sunshine, boy?" Megan joined her with a lead rope. "Remember what we practiced. Nice and slow, no pressure." They attached the lead rope to Dusty's halter and guided him toward the barn door. At the threshold, Dusty stopped, his ears twitching nervously. The bright sunlight seemed to overwhelm him, and he took a hesitant step backward. "It's okay," Claire murmured, her hand steady on the lead rope. "Take your time." Minutes ticked by as Dusty gathered his courage. Finally, he lifted one hoof and placed it carefully in the sunlight. Then another, and another. Each step was slow and deliberate, his legs shaking slightly from the effort. "That's it," Tom encouraged from the side. "He's doing great." Dusty paused halfway to the paddock, his head held high as he surveyed his surroundings. Claire could feel his uncertainty through the lead rope, but she also sensed his determination. "You know," Megan said softly, watching Dusty, "horses are a lot like people when it comes to trust. Once it's broken, it takes time and patience to rebuild. But look at him. He's trying so hard." Claire felt her throat tighten with emotion as Dusty took another step forward. After everything he'd been through, he was still willing to trust them. The thought made her heart swell with pride. Inside the paddock, Dusty's nose twitched at the smell of fresh grass. He lowered his head tentatively, taking his first bite. The simple act brought tears to Claire's eyes. "I never thought we'd get here," she whispered, pulling out her phone. She snapped a photo of Dusty grazing peacefully in the morning light and sent it to the nursing home staff to show Harold. Minutes later, her phone buzzed with a response. A photo of Harold in his wheelchair, tears in his eyes and a gentle smile on his face as he looked at Dusty's picture. Below it was a simple message from the nurse. "Harold says thank you." Claire sat in her car outside the real estate office, staring at the stack of unpaid veterinary bills on the passenger seat. Her savings account was nearly depleted, and her commission checks had gotten smaller as she spent less time showing houses and more time at the barn. "Claire, we need to talk," her boss Richard called out as soon as she walked through the door. His expression was stern as she followed him into his office. "Your numbers are down 30% from last quarter. What's going on?" "I've had some personal matters to attend to," Claire said, straightening her blazer. "I'll make up the difference." Richard leaned back in his chair. 3 clients called yesterday. You weren't available for any of them." He folded his hands on his desk. "I know you're good at what you do, Claire, but this is a business. If you can't prioritize your clients, I'll have to give your listings to someone who will." The warning hit her hard. On her lunch break, Claire drove to the barn, her mind racing with calculations. The feed costs alone were stretching her thin, not to mention the ongoing veterinary care. As she watched Dusty walking steadily around his paddock, she pulled up the contact information for a large equine rescue facility 2 counties over. Tom found her sitting on a hay bale, staring at her phone. "Something troubling you?" he asked, settling down beside her. "I can't keep this up," Claire admitted, her voice cracking. "The bills are piling up, and my job's at risk. Maybe Dusty would be better off at a rescue facility with more resources." Tom was quiet for a moment. "You know," he said finally, "this town has a way of coming together when someone needs help. Why not organize a fundraiser? Share Dusty's story, let people see how far he's come." Claire shook her head. "I couldn't ask people for money. This is my responsibility." "Nobody makes it alone," Tom said gently. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is ask for help. The volunteers gathered around as Tom shared his idea. Megan immediately offered to create social media posts, while others suggested a barbecue benefit and silent auction. Their enthusiasm was contagious, but Claire felt her pride wrestling with her desperation. "I don't know," she said, watching Dusty nuzzle against the fence. "What if nobody shows up?" "Then we're no worse off than we are now," Tom replied. "But I have a feeling Dusty's story might touch more hearts than you think." Claire looked at the determined faces around her and thought about how far they'd already come together. Finally, she nodded. "Okay," she said quietly. "Let's try it." The morning sun painted golden streaks across the park as Claire helped set up the last of the folding tables. Her hands trembled slightly as she arranged homemade cookies and brownies on paper plates. The local band, Mountain Creek Boys, tested their microphones while volunteers hung colorful banners announcing Save Dusty Community Fundraiser. "I can't believe how many people are here already," Megan said, rushing past with a box of raffle tickets. Cars filled the parking lot, and families streamed toward the park carrying lawn chairs and blankets. Claire's throat tightened as she watched neighbors greeting each other, examining the silent auction items, and gathering around Megan's photo display of Dusty's recovery journey. The smell of barbecue wafted through the air as Tom manned the grill, calling out to passers-by with a welcoming smile. A familiar face caught Claire's attention. Susan, walking toward her with two children bouncing excitedly beside her. "This is amazing," Susan said, looking around at the crowd. "The kids have been talking about nothing else since I told them about Dusty." "Can we meet him soon?" the younger child asked, eyes wide with anticipation. "Once he's stronger," Claire promised, touched by their enthusiasm. The band started playing as more people arrived, creating a festive atmosphere that felt almost surreal to Claire. She made her way to the small stage area, her hands clutching Harold's letter. The paper crinkled as she unfolded it, facing the gathered crowd. "I'd like to read something," she announced into the microphone, her voice steady despite her nerves. "This is from Harold Brown, Dusty's original owner." The crowd quieted as Claire began reading. "Dear friends and neighbors, though I cannot be with you today, my heart is full, knowing how many of you have opened your hearts to help Dusty. In my darkest times, I failed both my family and this gentle creature who deserved better. Through Claire's kindness and your generosity, Dusty has been given a second chance. You have not only saved a horse, you have given an old man hope for redemption. Thank you for showing me that it's never too late for healing." Claire looked up to see Susan wiping tears from her eyes, her children pressed close to her sides. Around the park, people were nodding, some reaching for tissues, others squeezing their loved ones' hands. As the afternoon progressed, raffle tickets sold out, auction items sparked friendly bidding wars, and the donation jar filled steadily. Tom approached Claire with a thick envelope, his weathered face beaming. "We did it," he said simply. "The community came through. Dusty's care is covered for months to come." Claire stared at the envelope, overwhelmed by the generosity surrounding her. That evening, after the crowd had dispersed and the park was quiet again, she made her way to the barn. Dusty's warm breath tickled her palm as she stroked his mane. "We're not giving up," she whispered, and Dusty pressed his head gently against her shoulder in response. The morning light streamed through the barn windows as Claire approached with a bucket of fresh water. Before she could call out, a loud neigh echoed through the air. Dusty stood at the paddock fence, his head held higher than she'd ever seen it, ears perked forward in recognition. "Would you look at that?" Tom chuckled from where he was fixing a fence post. "Someone's feeling mighty chipper this morning." Claire couldn't hide her smile as she watched Dusty trot along the fence line. His ribs still showed, but his coat had a healthier sheen, and his eyes sparkled with life. The other volunteers paused their morning chores to watch him move, his steps growing more confident each day. "He's like a different horse," Megan said, joining Claire at the fence. "Remember how he could barely stand when we found him?" Claire nodded, remembering those first desperate days. Now Dusty moved with growing grace, his muscles strengthening, his spirit returning bit by bit. The sight of him prancing around the paddock brought happy tears to her eyes. Tom approached them, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Ready for your grooming lesson?" he asked Claire. "Now that he's stronger, it's time you learned proper horse care." Claire followed Tom into the paddock, listening intently as he demonstrated how to approach Dusty from the side, speaking softly to let him know they were there. Tom handed her a curry comb, showing her the circular motions to use. "Gentle but firm," Tom instructed. "Let him feel secure in your touch." He stepped back, watching as Claire began grooming Dusty's neck. "That's it. See how he's leaning into it? He trusts you." As Claire worked, she marveled at how natural it felt now. Just weeks ago, she'd been terrified of doing something wrong, of somehow making things worse. But here she was, confidently caring for a horse, surrounded by people who'd become like family. "You've got quite a way with him," Tom observed. "Not everyone could have brought him back like this." Claire paused, surprised by the pride that swelled in her chest. She'd spent so many years measuring her worth by sales figures and client reviews. This feeling was different, deeper somehow. The sun was setting when Claire finished the evening feeding. She turned to leave, but felt a gentle push against her back. Dusty had stretched his neck over the fence, nudging her playfully with his nose. When she turned, he did it again, nickering softly. "Hey!" she laughed, the sound echoing through the barn. Dusty tossed his head, pawing at the ground with one hoof. His eyes held a mischievous glint she'd never seen before. "Well, I never," Tom called from the barn door. "Looks like someone's found his sense of humor." Claire reached out to scratch Dusty's forehead, and he leaned into her touch, still playing. This wasn't the broken creature she'd found chained in a dark barn. This was Dusty, as he was meant to be, spirited, playful, alive. Claire walked down the sterile hallway of Pine Grove Nursing Home, her footsteps echoing against the linoleum floor. The familiar scent of disinfectant filled her nose as she approached Harold's room, clutching her phone with its precious photos of Dusty. Harold sat slumped in his wheelchair by the window, thinner than she remembered from her last visit. His hands trembled slightly as he turned to face her. "Claire," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "you came." She pulled up a chair beside him, noticing how his hospital gown seemed too big for his shrinking frame. "I brought some new pictures of Dusty," she said, keeping her voice gentle. "Would you like to see them?" Harold's eyes lit up, though the rest of him remained still. Claire held her phone where he could see it, scrolling through photos of Dusty trotting in the paddock, playing with his new ball and greeting the volunteers. "He looks so much better," Harold said, pausing to catch his breath between words. A faint smile crossed his face as Claire showed him a video of Dusty nickering at the camera. When Claire finished sharing the updates, Harold's eyes grew distant. "Margaret, my wife. She always said Dusty had the kindest eyes." He shifted slightly in his chair. "She could see straight into a horse's soul," she'd say. "Dusty. He reminded me so much of her. Strong but gentle, patient." Claire listened as Harold's voice cracked with emotion. "After she passed, I couldn't bear to lose him too. Those poachers, they'd already taken one horse. I thought—" He closed his eyes, gathering strength. "I thought keeping him chained would keep him safe. Instead, I just hurt him more." "Dusty's healing now," Claire assured him, touching his arm gently. And so are the connections that were broken. He's teaching all of us about second chances. Harold nodded slowly, his eyes growing moist. "Claire?" he asked after a moment of silence. "Do you think, would it be possible to bring him here? Just once?" His voice trembled with hope and uncertainty. "I'd like to see him before." The request hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Claire sat there, her mind racing through the logistics and challenges of bringing a recovering horse to visit a nursing home. She thought about Harold's failing health and Dusty's limited mobility, unsure how to respond to such a heartfelt wish. Susan pulled up to the barn in her silver SUV, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly before cutting the engine. She sat there for a moment, watching through the windshield as Dusty grazed peacefully in the paddock. The morning sun cast long shadows across the freshly mowed grass, and the barn looked different from what she remembered. Cleaner, more alive. Claire emerged from the barn carrying a bucket of feed, offering Susan a welcoming wave. Susan stepped out of her car, keeping her distance from the fence where Dusty roamed. "He's doing so much better," Claire said, setting down the bucket. "The vet thinks he's gained almost 100 pounds since we started caring for him." Susan crossed her arms, watching as Dusty lifted his head to nibble at some fresh hay. "Dad used to spend hours out here with him," she said quietly. "Even after Mom died, he'd skip family dinners just to be with this horse. I never understood it." Claire leaned against the fence. "Harold told me Dusty reminded him of your mother, her gentleness, her strength." "That's just it," Susan's voice cracked slightly. "He wrapped himself up in memories instead of being there for us. For me." She watched as Dusty moved with growing confidence across the paddock. "But looking at him now, I'm starting to understand why Dad couldn't let go." Claire gestured toward the fence. "Would you like to meet him?" Susan hesitated, then slowly approached. Dusty noticed her presence and walked over, his step steady but careful. He stretched his neck toward her, and Susan held out her hand, trembling slightly. The touch of Dusty's soft muzzle against her palm sent an unexpected wave of emotion through her. Tears welled up in her eyes as she remembered summer afternoons spent watching her father train horses, her mother's laughter echoing across the fields. All the anger she'd carried, all the hurt of feeling second best to a horse. It seemed to shift inside her, making room for understanding. "Oh," she whispered as Dusty gently nuzzled her hand. Her tears fell freely now, years of pain finally finding their release. "I get it now, Dad. I finally get it." The evening sun cast long shadows across the barnyard as Claire finished her daily cleaning routine. Her boots crunched on the gravel as she carried empty feed buckets toward the barn door. Something white caught her eye, a piece of paper fluttering in the gentle breeze, pinned to the wooden door with a rusty nail. Claire's hands trembled as she pulled the paper free. The message, written in harsh black letters, made her blood run cold. "Keep that horse locked up and stay away from the forest. Some of us preferred him forgotten." She fumbled for her phone, calling Tom immediately. Within 20 minutes, his old pickup truck rumbled up the driveway. His weathered face grew serious as he read the note. "This isn't just random," Tom said, running a hand through his gray hair. "There's something you need to know about Harold and these woods." They sat on hay bales inside the barn while Dusty dozed in his stall. Tom's voice was heavy with memory as he spoke. "Harold had another horse before, a beautiful mare named Star. She disappeared one night after breaking through a fence near the forest. They found her 3 days later." He paused, shaking his head. "Poachers had taken her for meat and hide." Claire's stomach turned. "That's why Harold kept Dusty chained?" "He went a bit mad with grief after that, especially when his wife passed too. started seeing threats everywhere. But he wasn't entirely wrong. There are still folks around here who make money the wrong way. Claire looked over at Dusty, peacefully munching on hay, unaware of the darkness that had touched his past. The thought of anyone hurting him made her chest tight with anger and fear. "We need to protect him," she said firmly. Tom nodded, already pulling out his phone. "I know a guy who installs security systems. We can have cameras up by tomorrow." They spent the next hour walking the property, marking spots for camera placement. Tom pointed out the vulnerable areas, the gap in the tree line, the old fence by the forest edge, the dark corners behind the barn. The following afternoon, Claire watched as workers mounted weatherproof cameras on tall poles around the paddock and barn. Each one connected to an app on her phone, giving her a constant view of Dusty's surroundings. As she locked up that night, checking each latch twice, Claire understood Harold's paranoia better than ever. The forest loomed dark and mysterious beyond the paddock, and somewhere out there, someone wished Dusty harm. She patted his neck through the stall door, his warm breath ghosting over her hand. "I won't let anything happen to you," she whispered, and Dusty nickered softly in response. The early morning light filtered through the barn windows as Tom arrived, carrying an old but well-maintained saddle. Claire's stomach churned with nervous excitement as she watched him approach Dusty's stall. "You think he's ready?" she asked, biting her lower lip. Tom nodded, his eyes crinkling with warmth. "He's come so far. This is the next step in showing him he can trust again." They worked together methodically, Tom guiding Claire through each careful movement. First, they let Dusty smell and inspect the saddle, his ears twitching with curiosity. Tom demonstrated how to place the saddle blanket gently across Dusty's back, explaining the importance of smooth, deliberate motions. "Nice and easy," Tom coached as Claire lifted the saddle. "Let him feel secure with each step." Dusty stood remarkably still as Claire secured the saddle, only shifting slightly when she tightened the girth. His patience surprised her. This was the same horse who once trembled at sudden movements. With the saddle in place, Claire took a deep breath. The small group of volunteers gathered around the paddock fence, their presence supportive but making her more aware of what she was about to do. Tom helped her mount, his steady hands giving her confidence. As she settled into the saddle, Dusty tensed beneath her. Claire's heart raced, but she remembered Tom's lessons about staying calm. "It's okay, boy," she murmured, running her hand along his neck. "We've got this." Gradually, Dusty's muscles relaxed. Tom held the lead rope as they began walking slowly around the paddock. With each step, Dusty seemed to remember his training from years ago. His gait became smoother, more confident. The volunteers clapped softly as horse and rider made their first complete circuit. Claire felt something shift inside her, a connection she couldn't quite explain. This wasn't just about rehabilitation anymore. This was about trust, about two broken spirits helping each other heal. When they finished their short ride, Claire dismounted with Tom's help. Dusty immediately turned his head toward her, pressing his soft muzzle against her shoulder in a gentle nuzzle. Tears pricked at her eyes as she stroked his neck. "You're stronger than I ever imagined," she whispered, and the horse nickered softly in response. Claire walked down the sterile hallway of the nursing home, her steps quickening as she approached Harold's room. The excitement of sharing news about Dusty's successful ride made her heart feel lighter. When she entered, she found Harold sitting by the window, looking frailer than during her last visit. His eyes lit up when she showed him the photos of Dusty wearing the saddle. "He remembered everything," Claire explained, sitting beside him. "It was like watching him come alive again." Harold's hands trembled as he touched the pictures. "My boy," he whispered, his voice catching. Tears welled in his eyes as he looked up at Claire. I need to tell you something important." He paused, taking a shaky breath. "I don't think I'll be here much longer. The doctors, they say—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Claire's chest tightened as Harold grasped her hand. "Please promise me," he pleaded. "Promise me Dusty will have a good home. Someone to love him properly this time." "Of course," Claire assured him, squeezing his hand gently. "I'll make sure he's taken care of." Harold shifted in his chair, his expression brightening slightly. "There's something else you should know." He leaned forward, his voice growing stronger. "Years ago, before everything went wrong, my wife and we started a sanctuary for horses. Beautiful place, out near Miller's Creek." Claire listened intently as Harold described the sanctuary. "After Martha passed, I couldn't bear to go back. Just stopped talking to everyone there." He fumbled in his bedside drawer and pulled out a business card worn at the edges. "Margaret Jensen runs it now. She's good people. Maybe Dusty could find a home there." Claire took the card, uncertainty crossing her face. The idea of sending Dusty away, even to a sanctuary, made her stomach knot. But she tucked the card into her pocket. "I'll look into it," she promised. As she prepared to leave, Harold called her back. His hands shook as he reached for an old photograph on his nightstand. In it, a younger Dusty stood proudly beside a smiling woman with kind eyes, Harold's wife. The colors had faded, but the joy in the image remained clear. "Keep this safe for me," Harold said, pressing the photo into her hands. "It's one of the last pictures of Martha with him." Claire carefully placed the photograph in her purse, her throat tight with emotion. As she drove home, the weight of Harold's declining health and his wishes for Dusty pressed heavily on her heart. The sanctuary's business card seemed to burn in her pocket, a reminder that time was running out to fulfill her promise to Harold. The sound of metal scraping against metal jolted Claire awake. She sat up in bed, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through her bedroom window, she could see the barn's outline in the moonlight. Another clang echoed through the night. Claire grabbed her flashlight and phone, her hands trembling as she dialed Tom's number. She rushed outside in her pajamas and boots, the beam of her flashlight bouncing across the ground as she ran. The paddock gate creaked in the wind, left open by whoever had been there. Dusty paced back and forth, his hooves striking the ground nervously. His frightened whinnies pierced the darkness. "It's okay, boy," Claire called out, her voice shaking. The beam of her flashlight caught fresh tire tracks in the mud leading away from the property. Her stomach lurched at the sight. Tom's truck roared up the driveway 15 minutes later. He jumped out, flashlight in hand, and immediately began examining the scene. "Look here," he said, pointing to scratches on the gate's lock. "Someone tried to force it open." They found more evidence inside the barn, a dropped bolt cutter and scuff marks on the floor. "Poachers," Tom said grimly. "They must have gotten spooked and run off before they could get to Dusty." Claire's hands shook as she called the police. While they waited, Tom helped her check Dusty for any signs of harm. The horse pressed close to Claire, still agitated from the attempted theft. The police arrived and took statements, photographing the tire tracks and collecting the bolt cutters as evidence. "We'll increase patrols in the area," the officer promised, "but you should consider additional security measures." After they left, Tom helped Claire install new padlocks on all the gates. They set up motion-activated floodlights around the barn and paddock, the hardware store supplies they'd rushed to buy scattered around them. "I'll stay tonight," Tom offered, but Claire shook her head. "I need to be here with him," she insisted, pulling up a chair near Dusty's stall. The horse had finally settled, though his ears still twitched at every sound. As the night wore on, Claire pulled out the worn business card Harold had given her. Martha Jensen's name and the sanctuary's address stared back at her. She opened her phone's browser and began researching the sanctuary, her free hand absently stroking Dusty's neck through the stall bars. The sanctuary's website showed sprawling pastures protected by high fences and security systems. Pictures of happy, healthy horses filled the galleries. Claire's chest tightened as she scrolled through the images, knowing that despite her desire to keep Dusty close, she might need to let him go to keep him safe. The next morning, Claire sat at her kitchen table, staring at the sanctuary's phone number. Her coffee had gone cold, untouched. Finally, she took a deep breath and dialed. "Hello, Jensen Horse Sanctuary," a warm voice answered. "Hi, I'm calling about Harold Brown's recommendation," Claire said, her voice hesitant. "My name is Claire Moore." There was a pause, then an excited gasp. "Harold? Oh my goodness, how is he?" "I'm Margaret Jensen. Harold and his wife Martha were instrumental in starting this place." Claire explained Dusty's situation, her words tumbling out faster as Margaret listened with understanding murmurs. "Harold mentioned you might call someday," Margaret said. "Why don't you come see the sanctuary for yourself? We'd love to show you around." "I'd like that," Claire replied, relief flooding through her. Later that week, Claire and Megan drove down a winding country road, following Margaret's directions. As they crested a hill, Claire's breath caught in her throat. The sanctuary spread out before them, rolling green pastures protected by sturdy fencing, dotted with horses of all colors and sizes. Margaret greeted them at the gate, her silver hair pulled back in a neat braid. She led them past the main barn, where horses poked their heads out to investigate the visitors. "We have 23 horses right now," Margaret explained, each with their own story. They walked through immaculate facilities, medical rooms, indoor training areas, and spacious stalls. But what struck Claire most was the peaceful atmosphere. Horses grazed contentedly in the pastures, while staff members moved about their daily routines with gentle efficiency. "There's something special I want to show you," Margaret said, leading them to a small garden. A stone memorial stood among blooming flowers with a plaque that read, "In memory of Martha Brown. Her love for horses lives on." Martha was passionate about saving horses, Margaret explained, touching the memorial fondly. "She and Harold helped me establish this place. When she passed, it broke Harold's heart. We lost touch after that, but her spirit still guides everything we do here." Claire traced the letters on the plaque, thinking of Harold's grief and the years of isolation that followed. The sanctuary represented everything Martha had loved, everything Harold had tried to preserve in his own misguided way. On the drive home, Claire gripped the steering wheel tightly. Megan glanced at her with concern. "It's perfect," Megan said softly. "You know it is." Claire nodded, fighting back tears. "I do, but I never thought letting him go would be this hard." She thought of Dusty's gentle nudges, his trust in her, the way he'd helped her understand her own heart better. "I need to talk to Harold first. He should have a say in this." The road stretched ahead as Claire's mind wrestled with what she knew was right and what her heart wanted to hold on to. The morning air was crisp as Claire watched Tom and Megan prepare the horse trailer. Her hands trembled slightly as she checked her phone, confirming the nursing home's permission one last time. The fundraiser money had made this possible, covering not just the trailer rental, but also the special permits needed for this unusual visit. "He's ready," Tom called out, adjusting Dusty's lead rope. The horse looked healthier now, his coat gleaming in the early sunlight. Claire held her breath as they began the careful process of loading him into the trailer. To everyone's relief, Dusty remained calm, following Tom's gentle guidance up the ramp. Megan stood nearby, speaking softly and offering reassurance. Once secured, Dusty waited patiently, as if understanding the importance of this journey. At the nursing home, Staff members had prepared an area in the garden where Harold could meet Dusty safely. Claire's heart tightened as she saw Harold being wheeled out, looking frailer than ever, but with anticipation brightening his tired eyes. Tom led Dusty from the trailer with practiced ease. The horse's hooves clopped softly on the pavement as he approached the garden area. Harold's hands gripped his wheelchair's armrests, his eyes filling with tears at the sight of his old friend. Dusty's ears perked forward as he noticed Harold. With gentle encouragement from Tom, he stepped closer, stretching his neck to investigate the familiar figure before him. Harold extended a trembling hand, and Dusty lowered his head, his soft muzzle touching Harold's palm. "Oh, Dusty," Harold whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry, old friend. You were always such a good boy." Tears rolled down his cheeks as Dusty nuzzled his hand, showing no sign of resentment for the past. "You were Martha's pride and joy, her symbol of love and strength." The morning sun wrapped them in warm light as Harold continued to stroke Dusty's face, murmuring words of gratitude and regret. Claire stood nearby, watching this moment of healing unfold. With shaking hands, Harold reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "Claire," he called softly, holding it out to her. "This is my will. I want to make sure Dusty goes to the sanctuary when—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Claire understood. She took the envelope, her own eyes misting as she promised, "I'll make sure he's taken care of, Harold." "You have my word." She watched as Harold turned back to Dusty, his weathered hand moving slowly across the horse's neck one final time. The phone call came early on a Tuesday morning. Claire was just getting ready for work when Susan's trembling voice delivered the news. Harold had passed away peacefully in his sleep. Claire sat down heavily on her kitchen chair, her coffee growing cold beside her as she listened to the funeral arrangements. 2 days later, Claire stood among the small gathering at the cemetery. The autumn breeze rustled through nearby trees as the minister spoke about Harold's life. Susan stood close to her children, her face tear-stained, but composed. The service was simple, just as Harold would have wanted it. After the other mourners began to drift away, Susan approached Claire. They stood together, looking at the fresh flowers adorning Harold's grave. "Thank you," Susan said softly, her voice thick with emotion, "for everything you did, for Dusty, and—" She paused, wiping her eyes, "for helping us find our way back to Dad." Claire squeezed Susan's hand gently. "He loved you very much." Susan nodded, a sad smile crossing her face. "You know, when I was little, Dad used to let me ride our horses before school. He'd wake up extra early just to help me brush them and get them ready." She laughed softly at the memory. "After Mom died, those horses were all he had left of her. I was so angry that he chose them over us. But now I understand. He was just lost in his grief." They shared stories about Harold, finding comfort in memories both bitter and sweet. Susan described summer afternoons spent learning to ride, her father's patient instructions, and the pride in his eyes when she mastered a new skill. With each story, the weight of old resentment seemed to lift from Susan's shoulders. Later that afternoon, Claire drove to the barn. The familiar smell of hay and horses greeted her as she stepped inside. Dusty nickered softly from his stall, and she walked over to stroke his neck. Carefully, Claire took out the small wooden box she'd brought with her. Inside, she placed Harold's will and the cherished photograph of Dusty with Harold's wife. Her fingers lingered on the image, tracing the happiness captured in that moment. She set the box on a shelf near Dusty's stall, her promise to Harold echoing in her mind. Dusty pressed his nose against her shoulder, and Claire wrapped her arms around his neck, letting her tears fall quietly into his mane. The morning dawned crisp and clear as Claire methodically packed Dusty's belongings into neat boxes. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded his favorite blanket and gathered the grooming tools they'd used together during his recovery. From a small cloth bag, she pulled out a piece of worn leather, part of the halter Harold had specially engraved with Dusty's name years ago. She tucked it carefully into her jacket pocket. One by one, the volunteers arrived at the barn. Tom's weathered face showed the weight of the moment as he helped Claire load the last of the supplies into her truck. Megan wiped tears from her eyes as she gave Dusty one final brushing. "This guy taught me more about resilience than any textbook ever could," Megan said softly, running her hand along Dusty's neck. "I'll never forget him." Tom cleared his throat. "Remember that first day we started cleaning this old barn? Look at him now, strong and healthy. You did good, Claire. Real good." Other volunteers shared their own memories, how Dusty's recovery had inspired them, how his gentle spirit had touched their hearts. Each farewell felt like another thread loosening in the tapestry of connections they'd woven together. The drive to the sanctuary stretched out before them, miles of countryside rolling past the trailer windows. Claire kept checking the rearview mirror, making sure Dusty was traveling comfortably. Her mind wandered through the months since she'd first pushed open that rusted barn door. How different she was now from the detached realtor who'd only been concerned about liability. When they arrived, Margaret was waiting by the sanctuary gates, her warm smile as welcoming as Claire remembered. She led them to a spacious stall filled with fresh hay, sunlight streaming through large windows. "This will be his home when he wants shelter," Margaret explained, "but most of our horses prefer the pasture. We've got a special spot picked out for him with some of our gentler rescues." She showed them the rolling meadow, dotted with grazing horses and lined with sturdy fencing. "He'll be safe here," Margaret assured Claire. "No poachers, no chains, just peace and freedom." Claire nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. They led Dusty to the pasture gate, and Claire removed his halter one last time. For a moment he stood still, surveying his new home. Then, with careful steps that grew more confident, he moved into the open field. The morning sun caught his coat, highlighting how far he'd come from the emaciated horse she'd discovered. His muscles rippled as he picked up speed, testing his strength with each stride. Several yards out, he paused and turned back toward Claire. His soft whinny carried on the breeze, a farewell that broke through her careful composure. "You'll always be in my heart," she whispered, her voice catching as she watched him, knowing it was time to let him go. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees as Claire pulled into the sanctuary's gravel driveway. 6 months had passed since she'd left Dusty in Margaret's care, and her heart quickened with anticipation as she parked her car. Margaret greeted her with a warm hug. "You're going to be amazed by his progress," she said, leading Claire toward the pastures. "He's become quite the leader among our rescue horses." As they walked, Claire noticed the changes to the property: new fencing, fresh paint on the barns, and flourishing gardens. But what caught her eye was a beautiful stone marker near Dusty's favorite grazing spot. Margaret slowed their pace as they approached it. "We placed it here last week," Margaret explained, gesturing to the memorial plaque. The polished stone bore an engraving, "In loving memory of Harold and Sarah Brown, whose dedication to horses inspired this sanctuary. Their legacy lives on in every animal saved." Claire traced the letters with her fingers, remembering Harold's last days and the peace he'd found in knowing Dusty would be safe. A movement in the field caught her attention, a familiar chestnut coat gleaming in the sunlight. Dusty trotted toward them, his stride strong and confident, head held high. "He's the first to welcome new rescues," Margaret said proudly. "It's like he knows what they're going through. Last week, We brought in a traumatized mare, and Dusty stayed by her fence for hours, just keeping her company. Watching Dusty's transformation sparked something in Claire. She turned to Margaret. "I've been thinking about getting more involved here. Maybe helping with fundraising or using my real estate connections to expand the sanctuary." Margaret's eyes lit up. "We've actually been hoping to purchase the adjacent property. Having someone with your expertise would be invaluable." Over the next hour, they discussed plans for the sanctuary's future. Claire found herself getting excited about the possibilities, already mentally listing potential donors and grants they could pursue. As the sun began to set, Claire settled onto a wooden bench near Dusty's pasture. She pulled Harold's photograph from her purse, the one he'd given her that day at the nursing home. In it, a younger Harold stood beside his wife, both beaming as they held Dusty's reins. Dusty grazed nearby, occasionally lifting his head to check on her. His coat shone with health, his eyes bright and alert. When a group of younger horses galloped past, he joined them, matching their pace with powerful strides. Claire smiled, watching him run free. "Thank you for saving me, too," she whispered, holding the photograph close to her heart. If you enjoyed the story of Dusty, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.